The fire hose of news from America can feel like a lot these days.
If you're trying to figure out what to make of it all, we got you.
I'm Katie Simpson.
And I'm Paul Hunter. We're correspondents here in Washington,
working just around the corner from where much of the action is taking place.
2 blocks from the White House.
And that's the name of our new podcast.
For top-notch analysis of U.S. politics from a Canadian perspective, find 2 blocks from the White House every Wednesday wherever you get your podcasts.
Including YouTube.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
No one dreams of living with their parents forever. But in this economy, that childhood bedroom of yours, it doesn't look like it'll be collecting dust anytime soon. What used to be this natural progression of graduating high school, then moving out for post-secondary and finding a job and then buying a house and getting married and having kids, it isn't the norm anymore. And if it is, it's certainly not happening all within a 5-year span. Most Gen Z, myself included, are struggling to imagine financial freedom straight out of school, even if they invest in higher education and even if they get a job. Both Toronto and Vancouver are plagued with affordability crises. Everything is just so much more expensive, and wages and salaries are trailing far behind the cost of living, not even comfortably, but just getting by. The idea of home ownership, or even just renting a place on your own, seems to be getting farther and farther out of reach. So, that childhood bedroom, not looking too shabby. That is, if your parents are in a position to have you stay or want you to stay. What if they don't have enough savings to support adult children? Are we saying goodbye to the concept of the empty nester? I'm Maria Kestane, and today on The Big Story, I'm talking to Claire Gagné, an editor at Macleans and the author of an article that prompted today's conversation, Why Gen Z Will Never Leave Home. Claire, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
You know, in your article, you take us through the stories of several families who are going through this really interesting yet very familiar period of adult kids living with their parents during their 20s. One of the stories even had a man in his mid to late 30s living with his parents. And you describe this nuanced dynamic of families returning to the original dynamic of the household, yet everything being so much more different this time around. I'm curious to know what prompted you to write this story.
Yeah, so it was just one of those things where I just kept hearing about examples of people who were living at home, maybe parents who were at the stage where they thought their kids had sort of left the nest and they were imagining a different life, and then their child had gone away from university and had come home. So it was just something where I had heard, several examples in my own life. And then I also, I myself have teenagers, and I had been operating under an assumption that they would move out. It was just sort of, that the kind of trajectory that I was expecting. And it suddenly dawned on me that I live in downtown Toronto where rents are very expensive. And if they were going to be moving out in whatever would have been 5, 7, 10 years, what would that actually look like? Where would they be able to find a place? And what would that reality be for us as parents? Should we start thinking that maybe they can't move out? And so all those thoughts were percolating in my head. And I'm on staff at Macleans, and when I sort of said it aloud, everyone was like, yes, that is a story that we should dive into.
That's so interesting. And as you mentioned, you are a mom to teenagers. I think in your article, you wrote that one of your kids was going off to university or college last year. You wrote this article last year?
That's correct. So she is in university now, and she has decided to live at home during university.
There it is.
She's still here. Yes.
That must be so interesting and nuanced. The thoughts must be so nuanced for you as an adult, because obviously you love your kids and you do anything for them. But you do have these ideas of what that life for you, or if you're married, for you and your partner could look like after your kids leave, and then they might not leave. So it's very nuanced, and I'm sure those thoughts are delicate ones for sure.
Yeah, and I would say speaking, I spoke to lots of families, as you know, for the stories. And there was always this sort of push-pull between, I like them at home, but also I want them to spread their wings, but also it's nice to have the company. And I wasn't really, welcome at home. So sort of this, this feeling of being happy that they've provided an environment that their child feels so welcome in, but also what are the steps that are going to need to happen so that they can launch? Because I think as parents, and all the parents I spoke to sort of, had the same feeling where you want to see your kids succeed. And we do live in a society where success often looks like it's financial success. So it's getting that job, moving out, and standing on your own 2 feet independently is sort of how we judge success a lot in our society, and you want that for your kids. So those were the themes that really rang through strongly in a lot of my interviews with the families.
If we could go back in time, how was the idea of adulthood, let's say like in the 80s, changed compared to that now in 2026?
Yeah, so I think a lot of things, typical adult milestones have sort of gradually started to be delayed as time goes on. So whereas it was, sort of always expected that you would graduate from high school, maybe get a job, the next step would be moving out, then you're going to start a family, and all these things sort of happen in quick succession. All those things are delayed. So people are getting married later, people are taking longer to find their careers. So they might start a program, maybe finish a program, and then decide that's not for them. Also, often you need to do further schooling in order to get a job that, or even just to get a basic entry-level job. An undergrad degree often is not enough for that anymore, so people go on to grad school. And so there's just a lot of little realities of our life and our society today that make those milestones harder to reach on the timelines that they were perhaps reached in the past.
And do we think now, in this society that we live in, is the shame still kind of there? I feel like back in the day, if you didn't hit those milestones in that certain order, you were kind of frowned upon. But are we still seeing that kind of shame nowadays, or is it more acceptable, you think?
I mean, I could ask you if you're
Whoa.
someone living at home.
Is this play about me?
I think that from what I observed in the interviews that I did, is that there is still some, and there also is not. So what I mean by that is there are people who have ways of thinking where, and even this was in some of the responses to my article, which was very sympathetic, I think, to the families that are dealing with this. But there were responses like, oh, suck it up, you got to move out. Those were very prevalent. I didn't come across those sentiments in the actual families that I spoke to. So it wasn't this idea of like, my kids should be out and I'm embarrassed that they're not out, or I think it's their fault, they should be doing better. It was more, this is reality. And the sense that I got was, parents generally want to support their kids. And so they were wanting to support them in whatever way that they, could. And in lots of cases, it was by giving them that extra boost before they were eventually out on their own. Some of the parents that I did speak to, they were forced out. They were forced out at a young age. And so that, because there was that shame about staying at home, and they felt, they just felt the sense that they didn't want that for their own kids.
You talk about this idea of lagging productivity. That was so fascinating to me. Can you explain that to us, and how is that affecting how young people in Canada choose where to live?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm not an economist, and so productivity is, as a term, is hard for me to define. But I will say that the economists I spoke to really made the point home that this isn't a problem on an individual level, if it's a problem at all. But the idea is it's not that, parents didn't teach their kids financial responsibility, or didn't give them enough chores, or didn't, or were too helicopter parenty and they're unable to make it on their own. maybe that's the case in some families. But the idea is this is more of something that's happening on a macro level where the amount of money that a person can make, especially a young person starting out, if you look at the paycheck, the amount of money that's there compared to what it costs to live on your own, so to pay the rent as an individual person, and to pay for your food and whatever else people want to save, etc. The math doesn't add up. And so what's happening is our wages aren't keeping up with the cost of living in our society. And what happens in societies like that, this is other countries have these types of economies, is that what becomes very important is intergenerational wealth. So this idea of wealth transfer from one generation to another. And so in Canada and in the United States, we sort of had this like pull yourself up by the bootstraps, like get yourself out and build an independent, financially sufficient life on your own. And that isn't always possible in economies where there's lagging productivity. And so families that have that wealth and are able to maybe have, maybe they're thinking of, I have a family business and my kid will work in the business, or I have a home, another apartment that they can live in. So families are thinking about this right from when their kids are born. How am I going to support them? Because they know that wages are not enough. And that isn't something that we've really had to deal with in Canada until recently. And so this idea of parents putting down payments for their kids' homes, or helping out in other ways, it's becoming a lot more common, and that is because of just economic factors. Even something like paying for their education, or having an RESP that can support them through that, so that when they graduate, they don't have that debt to pay off before they can sort of start making those debts. That's another form of that sort of wealth transfer that we're seeing more of in Canada.
Yeah, a huge facet of this issue, as you mentioned, is that disconnect between wages and the cost of living. And, that old joke of, well, maybe if you don't buy a $7 coffee, you'll be able to afford a house. It really doesn't cut it anymore. It really doesn't apply. A report from this real estate company named Zoocasa said that according to their calculations, only Torontonians, need to make more than $86,000 annually just to live comfortably. And that's just to rent, not even home ownership. That's just to rent. When in reality, we know that across the board, those salaries are looking more in that 60 to 70 range. What do you make of that discrepancy?
I think it's a real challenge for a young person when they're trying to start a life. The people that I spoke to both parents and young people for the story, and it was just sort of, they were very pragmatic about it. I can't afford to move out, and it was sort of this idea of like, where does that leave me? Do I have to move? Do I have to leave this city that I've lived in, whether it's Toronto or another city where the rents are quite high? Do I have to leave and go to a smaller city? Do I have to leave the country? What do I have to do to reach that financial independence that we attribute adulthood to? And I think that a lot of them were quite just smart about the fact that if I stay at home, even though maybe I don't have the independence that I would if I moved out, maybe I'm kind of itching to get out from under my parents, under the roof, or sort of having that nagging the parents just can't help but do. I'm gonna sort of suck it up and stay at home so I can save to be able to eventually get there.
Yeah, I resonate with that so much because, I'm Gen Z. I'm in my mid-20s, and a lot of the conversations I have with my friends or my colleagues is that idea of like, oh, we're thinking of moving to this province or maybe this country and although that is so exciting, is that what it comes down to, having to like move, not even like out of the city, because we do know that young people, they move, at least in GTA, you could be working in Toronto and then you get married or you want to move out of your house, and then you realize that your options for renting, or if you want to buy, if you want to, own property, it's to go north or to go west or to go east. People going to, if you work in Toronto, but you're like, oh, I found a property in Caledon or in Grimsby. It's that is a reality, the fact that people are looking elsewhere to live, just to be able to afford it, which is crazy.
Yeah. And I think what, is frustrating is when you don't feel like you have a choice. And that is why I think there's sort of this feeling of, just this like, you probably put a better word to the feeling, but this frustration with the situation that people are in, where you kind of like want to start your life, but you're not quite sure how or even when it will be able to happen.
Right. And, earlier on, you mentioned how young people are continuing their education. And that's what we're told, to invest in ourselves, invest in the career and our education, and go off and do more education, go to masters, go do these opportunities. But, does it still pay off? Personally speaking, my fiance, he graduated from the University of Toronto, one of Canada's best schools. He went on to do his master's for 3 years. And after that, he still couldn't find a job, which is so disheartening for Gen Z, who want to invest, who want to go big and invest in themselves and take all these opportunities. But what are you left with at the end? If you're still left at square one, ultimately, thank God, my fiance found a job in Los Angeles, so he had to completely relocate. Is this idea of investing in yourself, is it real anymore? Is it worth it?
Yeah, it's really tough. I wish I had an answer. I don't. It's a really tough situation to be in. I don't envy anyone in the situation. It is hard. Those entry level, the workplace is changing. AI is, changing roles, and careers that people were told were like a sure thing, computer science, learn to code, things are, those even aren't sure bets anymore. And will that extra education get you a job? It's really tough. And I think a lot of people don't have answers and are trying to figure it out. And you kind of mentioned earlier, one of your questions is about the shame. And there's also sometimes this sense that, young people they're not trying hard enough. They're not doing, they're not willing to make sacrifices, give up that $7 coffee, etc. And as someone, I would say, for the young people that I spoke to when I was writing the article, none of that came through to me. Everyone that I spoke to wanted, was in doing education, was trying to better themselves, to be able to get a job, to be able to hit those milestones. It was everybody wanted the same thing, but just kept getting sort of come up against walls that were making it difficult to happen.
Yeah. I want to get into this idea of multi-generational living, which you discuss in your article. We know here in the West, kids, they graduate high school, they turn 18, and they're out. And if they're not out, some parents do expect some form of payment, and that's totally their prerogative, if that's what you expect of your kids. But in a lot of ethnic communities and European communities and South Asian communities, living with your parents, even after you get married is not only acceptable, but is actually the norm. What do you make of that discrepancy? What's is the Western Hemisphere, are we here in Canada and the US missing the benefits and the peace of multi-generational living?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it was almost something, it was top of mind from the beginning of my research, because like you say, it is in many cultures very common to stay at home into adulthood. So is there even a story here, right? Like, is there, what is the story? People are now catching up in Canada to what's been going on in other parts of the world. Is it just because there are, because of immigration into the country of different families that are more accepting, or this is more their norm? Is that why the numbers are trending this way? How does that play into the data and into the anecdotes, et cetera? That was top of mind throughout my research. And so a couple things. So the families that I spoke to so the typical Western philosophy that from their childhood, they were expected to move out at 18, etc. Don't care where you are, just not here. They had difficulty, you could tell, in their kids being at home, but they also enjoyed it. They kind of saw this the benefits of living with different generations living together that they obviously hadn't experienced before. But now that they had experienced it, they saw a lot of positives to it. So whether it was company, I think one of the anecdotes in the story is about a mom who shares a glass of wine with her adult son every once in a while. So, we have a loneliness epidemic in Canada. So having that built-in support right into the home with your family is a lovely thing. And that really did come through in the interviews I did. And also, even with chores, etc. I think what was coming up a lot was like, okay, but how do we navigate this? We don't have a roadmap for this because this isn't what it was like for me when I was this age. I was living on my own. I wasn't with my parents. So how do I parent now when I have my kids here? And what should my expectations of them be? And how do we not fall into that trap of sort of them, I'm the parent, so I'm doing everything and I'm feeling resentful because my kid is here and they're not helping out. Navigating those new realities, that theme came up a lot. And to your point of, maybe my kid's going to pay some of the rent, that actually is, that came up a lot too, is some of the parents needed the financial support.
Right.
So it went both ways where, the cost of living is going up for everybody. So having an adult child who maybe can't pay rent on their own, but can contribute to the household mortgage, rent payment, was actually beneficial for the parents as well. So, having that intergenerational support goes both ways.
Yeah. We know that one of your kids is living at home still and is in that phase of life of post-secondary. So I don't know necessarily if you are living intergenerationally at this point, but how do you think Canadians could embrace that sort of dynamic?
Yeah, you're right. I don't think you could qualify us as living intergenerationally, but I do, as your child gets older, you do see them maturing and being able to be more of a peer in the household versus that top-down relationship. And it is nice. And I think that it is something that can, as I mentioned, there are a lot of Canadians that are feeling lonely. There's a lot of sort of some of the fabric of our society that was perhaps there before, like people would maybe, go to church, have these like big family dinners. Those things aren't necessarily always available. And so, even if it's just one child that's staying at home and living with you, I think you can fill some of those voids that are, I think, are pretty prevalent in Canada.
Yeah. Claire, how do you see this issue playing out in the future? I mean, how sustainable is this? Is there even the concept of an empty nester anymore?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting phenomenon, and I think that some of the families that I interviewed, I think one of the dads was in his 70s. So yeah, like that, there is no empty nest at that point, and. The other thing to consider is that people are having their kids a lot later in life too. So if you're having your child a lot later and then they're moving out a lot later, maybe there will be no empty nest. It's hard to say.
All right. Definitely an interesting conversation. Claire, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
And that was The Big Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation. Send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or find us on Blue Sky @thebigstory. If you know someone that might enjoy this episode, be sure to send it to them. The Big Story is produced by me, Maria Kestane. Diana Kay is the head of strategy and content. Desi Nair is the manager of podcast operations. Thanks for listening. We'll chat next week.